What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here. Absolutely massive news video today. The Lunar New Year event was announced to be coming out tomorrow. This is the earliest it's ever came. This, of course, always brings some very unique skins, but what's probably going to be even more nutty is that we should expect the PTR to go live right with it. D.Va having crazy movement, Doomfist perhaps nerfed in the wrong direction, killing the character. But the biggest change, I think, is to Baptiste. Between the cooldown being extended and the uptime being reduced, the overall uptime of Lamp is way down compared to what it was on the live version of the game. And I think that, along with Mei freeze being a bit easier to dodge, we're going to expect to be playing in a completely different game tomorrow. And I'm pretty excited to hop into the ramifications of that, because I think the overall fairly muted response from the community is vastly underselling how the butterfly effect of some of these changes in key areas could come together. And speaking of changes, Jeff Kaplan popped onto the forums yesterday to post an extremely long and detailed post explaining a potential entire rework to Role Queue as we know it. Jeff says in this post that this radical change could come to the PTR for testing, which is usually not what they use the PTR for, by the way. He just admits that flat out. Usually it's for things they've already decided on, but Jeff explains that they're testing an incredibly radical change to Overwatch to change the base Role Queue variant of the game to be 3 DPS, 1 tank, 2 supports. So that's the larger overview. Let's get into the post itself, because the thought process here I think is quite enlightening. And then after the post, we'll recap with some reviewing points on how practical or beneficial this type of system might be. And here, Jeff is responding to a thread advocating for this exact change, one they've already been testing. But keep in mind that it's in light of the long DPS queue times, right? It's important to frame this. I see a lot of reactions to this thread be about the meta, and I don't think that's necessarily the goal. And instead, this is largely an experiment to try to form the way we queue for games in Overwatch to the player base we actually have. If we have way more DPS players and they all want to wait in line to play DPS, what would the ramifications be if we dropped out one of the roles that are unpopular in exchange for one that's much more popular? And this is Jeff's reply. Wow, it was super weird to stumble on this thread. In early December, we were brainstorming ways to shorten DPS queue times, and the idea was proposed to try changing the Role Queue team composition to be 1 tank, 3 damage, and 2 support. Our matchmaking engineers did some modeling around queue times, expected behaviors, etc., and all indicators pointed to an overall positive improvement to all queue times under a scenario like that. From a design perspective, we were reluctant for a number of reasons. Before implementing 222 Role Queue, we had done experiments with the team composition being 1 tank, 1 support, and 4 DPS. The playtests under a 4-1-1 comp were terrible. Jeff has actually talked about this a bit in the past as well. The problem was the solo support. As a solo support player, you felt unable to keep the rest of your team alive. Added to that, at all times, you had 5 very aggressive players prioritizing you as the target every time. As soon as the support player on one side died, the entire team would fall like a house of cards. So when the idea of trying a 3-2-1 comp came up, we were hesitant because of the poor play tests with 4-1-1. But we did something interesting in December, and I'm really proud of the team for sticking with it. Internally, for the past 2 months, we changed the game to be based on a 3-2-1 composition. When we queue for our playtests, we only get 1 tank per team each match. And we decided to, quote, live with it for December and January because we felt like the easy and natural thing for us all to do is just to say, hey, this is different and here are all the problems with it, and just dismiss the system. But by forcing the team to try it out and live with it for so long, it's challenged us to try to solve some of the problems that have surfaced. And there are a number of challenges. First, there was the issue of what players have come to call off tanks. The biggest issues center around D.Va, Zarya, and Roadhog. The current playstyle of those tanks, if you're adhering to various metas that have existed, is to pair them with other main tanks. Obviously, if we were to change the distribution of roles, it would require some balancing changes, but possibly more than that. Roadhog is a great example. Is the correct thing to do for Roadhog under that design to try to make him more main tanky, or is the correct thing to do to simply move him to the damage role and balance him as a damage damage character. We've tried both in our months of testing. If you were to come and play Roadhog today with us in a 3-2-1 experiment, he's moved from the tank to damage category and only has 400 health, take a breather, only heals and does not do damage reduction, and there was a bunch of other DPS changes to his scrap gun. Now don't freak out. We're not doing this for 2-2-2. I'm only sharing the design experiment that's going on here. Maybe a better direction for Roadhog under 3-2-1 is some sort of team damage reduction ability. How do you take what is essentially an off tank and make him into a main tank? That is what we would have to explore with any of these tank characters. Since the tank roster is already one of the more limited character selections, we're obviously not crazy about removing choice from tank players. And if our stated goal is to improve queue times, did going to one tank actually remove a bunch of otherwise tank players from the queue? Or were some of these, quote, tank players actually damage players who wanted a faster queue time, so they picked Roadhog? Obviously complicated questions, and it is even more complicated to be confident in the answer. The other fear around a 3-2-1 comp is the importance it places on the tank player. In our playtesting, this has manifested itself in two notable ways. Some players feel a lot of pressure to choose the, quote, correct tank. If there is only one tank, the team has a very strong opinion about who that tank should be. Another fear around this issue is that metas will be even more limited as players tend to take the path of least resistance towards their hero choices. If Reinhardt is deemed meta, do we only see Rein from now on? And are we all mad at our tank player if they play the hamster? 2. Some tank players feel a tremendous anxiety about their performance in the match. They felt like being the one lone tank put a lot of pressure on them, and if they died, it was a really big deal. Some of our tank and support players who would occasionally play tank stopped playing tank during 3-2-1 and only gravitated towards support because they felt intimidated to be the solo tank and have so much focus on their play. Conversely, there are a number of tank players on the team who actually enjoy the added spotlight. Traditionally, in video games, there are different personas that are attracted to different roles in games: tank, support, damage, etc. We saw this in World of Warcraft, and we see it in Overwatch. While these are stereotypes, and you have to be really careful about assuming too much here, there are many tank players who love being the lone tank and carrying the team to glory. Watching this play out in our weird internal experiment has been fascinating. Our support players have given mixed feedback on the experiment as well. On the negative side, people feel bad when the lone tank dies. On the positive side, many support mains have commented that they feel like they have more freedom to focus on other players and not just, quote, try to keep the big bags of health points alive all match. In general, these matches are more chaotic, feel more FPS-y. The result is good or bad depending on the type of player you are. For some of our support players, this makes matches more exciting. Everyone is taking a lot of damage under 3-2-1. For some players, the chaos causes negative anxiety and they just prefer healing tanks. The damage experience has been overall positive. For those of us like me who usually queue for all three roles, we're often pleasantly surprised to actually get to play damage. Also, many on the team have cited that with 3 damage dealers, they feel far less pressure than they do in the current live game with only 2 damage. The compositions have been very interesting. For example, you can have a 2 sniper comp and have a flanker. It's really opened up the game. If you're evaluating pluses and minuses, it adds to the chaos, makes the gameplay more like a traditional FPS because there's less barriers and damage mitigation going on, but also detracts a bit from the team play. Speaking of team play, one of our testers who did not like the experiment made a comment that he felt the 3-2-1 detracted from team play too much. I found this fascinating because in 2013-2014, when they were developing Overwatch, every decision we made was to embrace and encourage or force team play at all costs. We put so much effort into putting the focus on team victory/defeat rather than individual performance, but in 2020, we feel like the overemphasis on team play, while great for hyper-competitive players in situations such as the Overwatch League, causes a lot of psychological pressure on your average player just looking to blow off steam in a video game. I guess what I'm saying is, that in 2020, feeling like you can deviate from team play a little bit in Overwatch and have some success feels like a good thing, not a bad thing to me. The other analogy I've used, and I know how you all hate my sports analogies, is that Overwatch in its current evolved form, I like it, it's almost like he's calling it Powercraft, feels like an American football game to me where every match is 4th down on the goal line. And for those who don't get the analogy, it's essentially a high-pressure, execution-based, high-risk play where you have to execute a very specific set of tasks in order to complete it, and if you don't, there's a high downside, and it feels really bad to lose. Jeff goes on, the amount of team synergy and execution required to pull off a victory is exciting, but also a little intense. There was something nice about a bit more loose/skirmishy version of the game, but again, it's all opinions and perspective. Not everyone on my team agrees with me, and that's a good thing. The other odd thing about testing this is when we started, everyone treated it like it was one of Jeff's crazy experiments, and was a super different, challenging, and possibly stupid idea. I tried to calm people down by reminding them that most of the matches in Overwatch history since launch, up until the release of Role Queue, were actually played with one tank or less. After a few of the early playtests in December, I remember one developer giving feedback that, quote, the game felt like old school Overwatch like when we first launched. I tried to point out that the reason they felt that way is because we used to play the game this way all the time. It shouldn't be that surprising or different. Let's all remember the surprising thing back then is when we actually had two tanks, implying that having one was the norm. So it's been a very interesting and fun experiment. We're not really confident that it's the correct thing for the game. It solves a lot of problems, but also introduces a lot of problems, like most things in the world of game design. I am really proud of the Overwatch team for experimenting with it the past 2 months. We're really conflicted on it, so it was cool to see you bring up the idea. We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on it. We've also been brainstorming if there is a way to bring this experiment to the community somehow, either through the PTR or the live game somehow. We don't want to freak people out though. Usually when this stuff hits the PTR, we intend for it to go live or some version of it, but this is much more of an early experiment more than anything else. Anyway, thanks for proposing ideas like this. This is an awesome post from Jeff. I'm so thankful and happy to know that these types of radical experiments are going on behind the scenes, and this is exactly the type of communication the community has been craving for so long. We love this from the developers, and even if we're not getting developer updates, this kind of insight into where their head's at, I think just satiates so much of the player base in knowing that the game has a direction that they're aiming for and trying to deal with problems like, in this case, queue times, as well as maybe fun factor a little bit. Blizzard has proven that their goal is to shape the game around their players' behavior, which is interesting. And if they just mathematically have triple the DPS to tank players, a solution to that would be to form the game around the player base they have, rather than trying to force the gameplay to be 2-2-2, which forces DPS players to get the short end of the stick and wait a long time to play the role they're interested in. The other aspect of this, I think they have attempted with a character like Sigma to give DPS players something that they can relate to, just like with Baptiste and Ana. More of these high skill cap characters in the roles are, I think, attempting to draw players away from damage into them, but I don't think it's had that effect too much. A little bit, but not like in a drastic way. And perhaps there would be a higher amount of tank players if they got to play the popular tanks like Reinhardt and Winston more. I think Orisa being pretty meta is a big deterrent to people being interested in tank, but I'm not sure to what degree. I will say that when Jeff describes the type of player that likes to play tank on hard mode, where there's a lot of pressure on you, I'm actually that type of player. Some of my favorite team compositions to play in was when 3 DPS was an option. I loved watching it, loved playing it. I learned much of the precise, low resource intensive Winston play from Nox, who played on Rogue back in the day when they more or less pioneered the triple DPS strategy. For a recent example, you can look to the Shanghai Dragons in Stage 3, demolishing Goats. 3 DPS is very FPS-y, where I think Jeff tries to give specific examples of the feeling it makes for players to be put in that situation, but something that I don't think he describes that would be a byproduct of it is that everyone would have to relearn Overwatch. In a lot of review videos, I talk about how so many players kind of feel like they're forced to be magnets to the payload and the main fight and don't really play the map. They don't know how or where or when to flank. A lot of times high ground just goes completely ignored. And all of that is like fundamental FPS stuff that would be intensified and exploded and be way, way, way more important if we had triple DPS mirrors all the time, because you just physically don't have the protection to ever maintain in the sort of standard death ball playstyle that everyone kind of conforms to, no matter if the situation calls for it or not. So that's a bit of a problem for me, because I think high-level players will kind of love the change, but low-level players will feel lost and feel like the game is just far more difficult and punishing than they're used to, and may feel alienated by that change. On the other hand, I think a lot of that problematic gameplay for the lower levels came from the variance in team comp from game to game. So if you had a 2-2-2 comp half of your playtime and then 0 tanks the other half, it can be difficult to adjust. Whereas over time, you would think that it would just be normalized for all levels, that this is just more of an FPS game. So that jarring effect, I think, given enough time, everybody could probably catch up to. Whereas prior to Role Queue, you were always shifting between the types of playstyles you were in. It was just so much information for a player to absorb. The way you play Ana with 2 tanks is totally different to the way you need to successfully play Ana with 4 DPS. If it's normalized, might transition comfortably eventually, but I think there'd be a huge growing pain period of time where the MOBA elements of Overwatch just like vanish overnight. But to devil's advocate my own point, is that a necessary sacrifice we have to make? They made sacrifices when Role Queue came out that I felt were sort of necessary. Is this yet again another one that would push Overwatch in a direction that where the benefits outweigh the negatives? The game feels like Overwatch with 2 tanks. It feels like a hardcore FPS game with 1. No matter how you end up balancing it. So I'll be interested to see what your guys' responses is in the comment section down below. Is Overwatch ready to go super hardcore FPS? Or are we just going to have to deal with having super long queue times for DPS all the time? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.